Sarah Chun stepped off the military transport bus into the blazing heat of Fort Braxton, her single duffel bag slung over her shoulder. The advanced sniper training facility stretched before her like a small city of concrete buildings and training ranges. The sound of distant gunfire echoed across the desert landscape, a constant reminder of what lay ahead. She wasn't supposed to be here. At least, that's what everyone seemed to think as she made her way toward the registration building. Other candidates moved with obvious military bearing, their movements sharp and confident. Most were men, tall and broad-shouldered with buzzed hair and faces that had seen combat. They looked like they belonged. Sarah, on the other hand, stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with long black hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her Asian features were delicate, almost fragile-looking, and she moved with a quiet grace that seemed out of place among the hardened soldiers. When she spoke, her voice was soft, requiring people to lean in to hear her properly. The registration officer, Sergeant Martinez, looked up from his clipboard with undisguised surprise when Sarah approached his desk. He glanced at her paperwork twice, checking the photo against her face as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "Sarah Chun?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of confusion. "Yes, Sergeant. You're here for the advanced sniper program?" "That's correct." Martinez studied her for a long moment, then shook his head slightly and processed her paperwork. As she walked away, Sarah heard him mutter to another officer, "This ought to be interesting." The dormitory assignment put Sarah in a room with 3 other candidates, all men who had been through basic sniper training and were here for advanced certification. When she entered the sparse room with 4 bunks and lockers, the conversation stopped completely. Her roommate, James Rodriguez, was a decorated Army Ranger who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan. He was built like a linebacker, with arms covered in tactical tattoos and scars that told stories of close calls in combat zones. When he saw Sarah, his expression shifted from confusion to something that might have been amusement. "You sure you're in the right place?" he asked, not unkindly but with obvious skepticism. "The administrative offices are in Building C." "I'm exactly where I need to be," Sarah replied calmly, setting her bag on the remaining empty bunk. The second roommate, Marcus Thompson, was a Marine Corps veteran with a reputation as one of the best shooters in his unit. He looked Sarah up and down with unconcealed doubt. "No offense, but this program washes out guys who've been training their whole lives. It's not exactly beginner-friendly." "Good thing I'm not a beginner," Sarah said, beginning to unpack her belongings. The third man, David Kumar, had been quiet during the exchange, but Sarah noticed him watching her carefully. He was smaller than the other 2, though still considerably larger than Sarah, and something in his expression suggested he might be reserving judgment rather than jumping to conclusions. That evening, as the candidates gathered in the main briefing room, the scope of what Sarah was facing became clear. 32 people had been selected for this program. Sarah was not only the only woman, but she was also the youngest and smallest person in the room. When she sat down, several candidates turned to stare, and she could hear whispered comments from various corners. "Is this some kind of diversity quota thing? Maybe she's here to document the training or something. There's no way she makes it past the first week." Instructor Captain Rebecca Hayes entered the room, her presence immediately commanding attention. Hayes was a legend in sniper circles, with confirmed kills from 3 different conflict zones and a reputation for being absolutely ruthless in her training methods. She was also a woman, which Sarah noticed caused some of the whispers to die down slightly. "Welcome to Advanced Sniper Training," Hayes announced, her voice carrying easily through the room. "Over the next 8 weeks, we will push you beyond what you think are your limits. We will break down everything you think you know about shooting, about patience, about precision, and about yourself." She began pacing in front of the assembled candidates, her steel-gray eyes sweeping across their faces. "Some of you think you're here because you're good shots. You're wrong. Being a sniper requires more than just marksmanship. It requires mental discipline that most people don't possess. It requires the ability to remain perfectly still for hours at a time. It It requires making life and death decisions in split seconds while remaining completely calm. Hayes paused her pacing and looked directly at several candidates, including Sarah. Some of you don't look like snipers. Some of you don't have the background we typically see. That doesn't matter. What matters is what you can do when everything is on the line. The captain outlined the program structure. Physical fitness training at dawn, marksmanship practice through the morning, camouflage and concealment techniques in the afternoon, and tactical theory in the evening. Weekends would involve extended field exercises where candidates would be expected to remain in position for up to 36 hours at a time. The failure rate for this program is 73%, Hayes continued. Most people who fail do so not because they can't shoot, but because they can't handle the mental pressure. They crack under the stress, they lose focus at critical moments, or they simply don't have the psychological makeup required for this kind of work. After the briefing, as candidates dispersed to their dormitories, Sarah overheard more conversations about her presence. The general consensus seemed to be that she was either incredibly brave or completely delusional, and that she would be gone within days. Rodriguez approached her as she was reviewing her training manual. "Look, Sarah, I don't want to discourage you, but this program is brutal. I've seen guys with years of military experience wash out in the first week. Maybe you should consider whether this is really what you want to put yourself through." Sarah looked up from her manual, meeting his eyes steadily. "I appreciate your concern, but I didn't come here because I thought it would be easy. I came here because it's necessary." "Necessary for what?" For a moment, Sarah's composed expression flickered, and Rodriguez caught a glimpse of something deeper in her eyes. Pain, determination, and something that might have been anger. But the moment passed quickly, and her calm demeanor returned. "For keeping promises," she said simply, then returned to her reading. That night, as her roommates settled into their bunks, Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling. She could hear whispered conversations from other rooms, and her name came up frequently. The doubt and skepticism didn't surprise her. She had faced similar reactions her entire life, whenever she had attempted something that people thought was beyond her capabilities. What they didn't know, what none of them could possibly understand, was that Sarah had been preparing for this program since she was 8 years old. Not consciously, not with any awareness that she would one day be lying in a military dormitory surrounded by skeptical soldiers, but preparing nonetheless. The path that had led her here began in a small apartment in Sacramento, California, where a little girl learned to be perfectly still and silent for hours at a time, where she learned to focus her attention with laser-like precision on tiny details that most people would miss, where she discovered that survival sometimes depended on abilities that had nothing to do with size or strength. Sarah reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small photograph that she kept with her always. Even in the dim light of the dormitory, she could make out the face of the person who had taught her the most important lessons about courage and determination. The person for whom she would endure whatever this program threw at her. Outside, the desert wind rattled the windows, and the distant sound of night training exercises echoed across the base. Tomorrow would bring the first real test of whether Sarah Chum belonged here. But tonight, she allowed herself to remember why she had come and to draw strength from the promise that had brought her this far. The other candidates might think they knew what motivated elite snipers. They thought it was about glory or patriotism or the thrill of precision shooting. Sarah knew better. Sometimes the most powerful motivations were deeply personal, forged in circumstances that had nothing to do with military service, but everything to do with protection, justice, and keeping the people you love safe from those who would hurt them. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Sarah's last conscious thought was a promise renewed. She would prove that belonging wasn't about fitting expectations, but about having the strength to fulfill your purpose regardless of what others thought you were capable of achieving. That be the alarm clock rang at 4:30 in the morning, jolting the dormitory awake. Sarah was already dressed and ready having learned long ago that being prepared ahead of time was often the difference between success and failure. Her roommates stumbled around in the darkness, grumbling about the early hour, while she sat quietly on her bunk, mentally reviewing everything she had studied the night before. Physical training began at 5 o'clock sharp, and Captain Hayes made it clear from the first minute that this would not be ordinary military fitness. The program was designed specifically to test the physical and mental endurance required for sniper operations. Snipers often have to remain motionless for extended periods. Hayes explained as the candidates assembled in the pre-dawn darkness. Your body needs to be able to maintain stability and control even when you're exhausted, hungry, and operating on minimal sleep. The first exercise was a 5-mile run through the desert terrain surrounding the base. Sarah knew this would be her biggest challenge. While her smaller frame gave her certain advantages, raw physical strength and speed were not among them. As the group set off at a punishing pace, she quickly found herself falling toward the back of the pack. Rodriguez and Thompson, despite their larger builds, moved with the efficient stride of experienced distance runners. Other candidates, clearly accustomed to military fitness standards, maintained steady paces that Sarah struggled to match. By the second mile, she was breathing hard and beginning to fall behind. "Come on, Chun," one of the candidates called back mockingly. "We haven't even gotten to the real training yet." Sarah forced herself to maintain her pace, drawing on techniques she had learned not in any gym or training facility, but in the cramped apartment where she had grown up. When food was scarce and stress was high, she had learned to push her body beyond what seemed possible to find reserves of energy and determination that others didn't know existed. By the fourth mile, several of the larger candidates were beginning to struggle with the heat and difficult terrain. Sarah, meanwhile, had found her rhythm. Her smaller size meant she required less energy to maintain her pace, and her experience with sustained hardship gave her a mental advantage over those who had never really been tested. She began passing tired candidates, her breathing steady and controlled. Rodriguez, who had been running near the front of the pack, glanced back in surprise as Sarah moved past him with what appeared to be increasing strength rather than diminishing endurance. When the run concluded, Sarah finished in the middle of the pack, far better than anyone had expected. Several candidates who had started strong were now bent over, gasping for breath, while Sarah remained upright and alert. "Interesting," Captain Hayes observed, making notes on her clipboard. "Size isn't everything, is it?" The morning marksmanship training took place on the 1,000-yard range, where candidates would demonstrate their basic shooting skills with the M24 sniper rifle system. This was where Sarah expected to prove herself, and where many of her critics expected her to fail definitively. Each candidate was given 5 rounds and instructed to engage targets at progressively longer distances, starting at 400 yards and working up to 800 yards. The morning light was perfect with minimal wind and clear visibility. Sarah approached the firing line with the calm confidence that had carried her through difficult situations before. As she settled into position behind the rifle, she felt the familiar sense of focus that came when everything else faded away except the target and the shot. The first shot at 400 yards was a center hit, clean and precise, exactly where she had aimed. Around her, other candidates were achieving similar results, and there were nods of approval from the observing instructors. The second shot, at 500 yards, was again a perfect center hit. This one drew more attention, as the increased distance began to separate the truly skilled shooters from those with merely adequate abilities. By the time Sarah reached the 600-yard target, a small crowd of candidates and instructors had gathered to watch. Her shots continued to group tightly in the center of the target, each one placed with mechanical precision that seemed almost effortless. At 700 yards, only Sarah and 3 other candidates were still maintaining center hits. The morning wind had picked up slightly, adding an additional challenge that required careful calculation and adjustment. Sarah's shot was delayed as she took extra time to read the wind conditions, but when she fired, The result was another perfect hit. The final shot, at 800 yards, was where most candidates began to struggle significantly. The target appeared tiny through the scope, and the margin for error was essentially zero. Sarah took nearly 2 minutes to prepare this shot, adjusting her position minutely and taking multiple wind readings. When she fired, there was a long pause as the spotters confirmed the hit. Then, Captain Hayes announced center hit. Perfect score. The silence that followed was profound. Sarah had just outshot every other candidate in the group, including several who had years of military marksmanship training and multiple deployments in combat zones. Rodriguez was the first to speak. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Sarah ejected the spent brass from her rifle and began cleaning the weapon with practiced efficiency. "Practice," she said simply. But Thompson wasn't satisfied with that answer. "No, seriously. That was some of the best shooting I've ever seen, and I've worked with guys who've been doing this for 15 years. What did you train?" Sarah paused in her cleaning routine, considering how much to reveal. The truth was complicated, and she wasn't sure these men were ready to understand it. But something in their expressions suggested genuine respect rather than mere curiosity. "I learned from my grandfather," she said finally. "He taught me to shoot when I was 8 years old. Military? No, he was a hunter, but more than that, he believed that everyone should know how to protect themselves and the people they care about." What Sarah didn't explain was the full context of those lessons. How her grandfather, Chun Wei, had immigrated to the United States with skills learned during a very different kind of conflict in another country. How he had recognized in his granddaughter a natural ability that could be developed into something extraordinary. How those shooting lessons had taken place not on military ranges, but in remote areas of the Sierra Nevada mountains, where an old man had taught a young girl that precision and patience could overcome almost any disadvantage. The afternoon brought camouflage and concealment training, where candidates learned to make themselves invisible in natural environments. This was another area where Sarah's smaller size proved advantageous, as she required less space and fewer materials to effectively conceal herself. Instructor Sergeant Williams led the group to a wooded area near the base and explained the principles of natural camouflage. "The human eye is trained to look for certain patterns and shapes," he explained. "Your job is to break up those patterns and disappear into the background." Each candidate was given basic camouflage materials and 30 minutes to create a concealed position. They would then have to remain motionless for 2 hours while instructors attempted to locate them. Sarah selected a position beneath a fallen log, using natural debris and her camouflage net to create what appeared to be just another piece of forest floor. Her small frame allowed her to fit entirely within the concealment, leaving no protruding limbs or equipment visible. The waiting began, and this was where Sarah truly excelled. While other candidates shifted restlessly, trying to find comfortable positions for their larger frames, Sarah remained perfectly still. The ability to remain motionless for hours was something she had learned not through military training, but through much more personal and urgent circumstances. As a child, when angry voices filled the apartment and danger was present, Sarah had learned to make herself invisible. She had developed the ability to control her breathing, to ignore physical discomfort, and to maintain absolute stillness for as long as necessary. What had once been a survival skill in a domestic environment now proved invaluable in military training. 2 hours later, when the exercise concluded, Sarah was one of only 4 candidates who had remained undetected. Several others had been spotted within the first 30 minutes, unable to maintain the necessary discipline and stillness. "Outstanding work, Chun," Sergeant Williams commented as she emerged from her concealment. "Have you done this kind of training before?" "Something like it," Sarah replied, carefully packing away her equipment. That evening, during the tactical theory session, Captain Hayes began discussing the psychological aspects of sniper operations. "Being a sniper is not just about shooting," she explained. "It's about making life and death decisions under extreme pressure. It's about maintaining clarity and focus when everything around you is chaos. She looked directly at Sarah as she continued. It's about understanding that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with the largest weapons or the strongest soldiers, but with precision, patience, and the will to do whatever is necessary to protect innocent people. The words hit Sarah with unexpected force. This was exactly why she was here, exactly what had driven her to endure the skepticism and doubt of the past day. She wasn't here to prove herself to these men or to satisfy some personal ambition. She was here because she understood, perhaps better than anyone else in the room, what it meant to be responsible for protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. After the session, as candidates returned to their dormitories, Rodriguez approached Sarah with a different attitude than he had shown the day before. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I made assumptions about you that were wrong. Today proved that you belong here just as much as anyone else." "Thank you," Sarah replied. "But I didn't come here to prove anything to anyone else. I came here for my own reasons. Can I ask what those reasons are?" Sarah considered the question carefully. She had spent her entire life being underestimated and overlooked, and she had learned the value of keeping her motivations private. But something about Rodriguez's genuine change in attitude made her willing to share at least part of the truth. "I made a promise to someone very important to me," she said. "This training is how I honor that promise." Rodriguez nodded, seemingly understanding that this was as much as Sarah was willing to reveal. As she prepared for sleep that night, Sarah reflected on the day's events. She had proven that she could compete with the best candidates in the program, but that was just the beginning. The real challenges lay ahead, and she would need to draw on reserves of strength and determination that went far deeper than anything her fellow candidates could imagine. The photograph in her pocket reminded her of why she was here, and of the promise that would carry her through whatever difficulties lay ahead. Tomorrow would bring new tests, new opportunities to prove that belonging was earned through performance, not granted through appearance or background. Week 3 of the program brought the first major elimination exercise, and the pressure in the dormitory was palpable. Of the 32 candidates who had started, only 21 remained. Some had failed the physical requirements, others had cracked under the mental pressure, and a few had simply realized that sniper training wasn't what they had expected. Sarah had consistently performed in the top 5 candidates across all categories, a fact that had gradually shifted the atmosphere around her from skepticism to grudging respect. Her roommates no longer questioned her presence, and several other candidates had begun seeking her advice on breathing techniques and mental focus. But Captain Hayes warned the remaining candidates that week 3 would be different. "Up until now, we've been testing your individual skills," she announced during the Monday morning briefing. "This week, we're going to test how you function under real operational stress." The exercise was called Guardian Angel, and it was designed to simulate the psychological pressure of actual sniper operations. Each candidate would be assigned to protect a simulated civilian convoy as it moved through hostile territory. The candidates would have to remain in concealed positions for up to 48 hours, watching for threats while dealing with hunger, fatigue, and environmental stress. What made the exercise particularly challenging was that it included actors playing civilians who were unaware they were being protected. The snipers had to remain completely hidden while ensuring the safety of people who had no idea they were in any danger. Sarah was assigned to a position overlooking a mountain road where a family would be camping for 2 days. Her job was to watch for potential threats while remaining completely undetected. Failure to spot a threat or being discovered by the civilians would result in immediate dismissal from the program. She established her position before dawn on Wednesday morning, using a natural depression in the rocky hillside that provided excellent visibility while keeping her completely concealed. The family arrived late Wednesday morning, a husband and wife with 2 young children who appear to be on a genuine camping vacation. As Sarah watched the family set up their campsite through her scope, she was struck by how normal and peaceful they seemed. The children laughed as they helped pitch the tent, and The parents moved with the relaxed efficiency of people who had done this many times before. It reminded Sarah powerfully of camping trips from her own childhood, before everything had changed. The first 12 hours passed without incident. Sarah maintained her position through the heat of the day and into the cool mountain evening, watching the family enjoy their dinner around a campfire. She rationed her water carefully and ignored the growing hunger in her stomach, focusing entirely on scanning the surrounding area for potential threats. It was during the second night that the first test came. At approximately 2 in the morning, Sarah spotted movement in the tree line across the valley. 3 figures in dark clothing were moving carefully toward the family's campsite, and something in their movements suggested hostile intent. This was exactly what the exercise was designed to test. Sarah had to make a split-second decision about whether these were actual threats or simply part of the simulation designed to test her alertness. The problem was that the exercise had been designed to be as realistic as possible, and she couldn't be certain whether the approaching figures were actors or real dangers. Through her scope, Sarah could see that one of the figures was carrying what appeared to be a weapon. Her heart rate increased, but her breathing remained steady and controlled. This was the moment that all her training had prepared her for, both in this program and in the years before she had ever considered military service. Sarah activated her radio to report the threat, speaking in barely audible whispers. "Control, this is Guardian Angel 7. I have 3 potential hostiles approaching the family from the northeast. One appears armed. Request instructions." The response was immediate. "Guardian Angel 7, you are cleared to engage if necessary to protect the civilians. Use your judgment." What happened next would become legendary in sniper training circles. Sarah tracked the 3 figures as they approached the campsite, waiting until she could clearly determine their intentions. When the armed figure raised his weapon toward the sleeping family's tent, Sarah knew this was no simulation. Her shot was taken from over 600 yards in darkness, with a crosswind that required precise calculation. The bullet struck the armed figure's weapon, disabling it without causing permanent injury. The sound of the shot echoed through the valley, and the 3 intruders immediately fled. Within minutes, local law enforcement arrived at the campsite, having been alerted by Sarah's radio call. It turned out that the 3 men were actually attempting to rob the camping family, and Sarah's intervention had prevented what could have been a serious crime. The family was evacuated safely, never realizing how close they had come to danger or that they had been protected by a hidden guardian angel throughout their camping trip. Sarah maintained her position until officially recalled, having successfully completed an exercise that had become unexpectedly real. When she returned to base, Captain Hayes was waiting with expression that mixed concern with professional admiration. "Chun, that was either the best judgment call I've ever seen from a trainee or the luckiest guess in military history. How did you know those weren't actors?" Sarah considered the question carefully. The truth was that she had recognized something in the movements and posture of the approaching figures that reminded her of other dangerous men she had encountered in her life. There had been a predatory quality to their approach that no actor could have replicated convincingly. "Experience," she said simply. "I've seen people with bad intentions before." "Where?" Hayes pressed. "Your background check shows no military or law enforcement experience." Sarah met the captain's gaze steadily. "Not all dangerous situations involve military or law enforcement, ma'am. Sometimes civilians have to protect themselves and their families." Hayes studied Sarah for a long moment, clearly sensing that there was much more to this answer than was being revealed. But something in Sarah's expression warned against pushing further, and the captain simply nodded. "Outstanding work, Chun. You may have saved those people's lives." The success of the Guardian Angel exercise elevated Sarah's standing within the program dramatically. Word of her nighttime shot had spread throughout the training facility, and even instructors who had been skeptical of her presence now treated her with obvious respect. But the exercise had also triggered memories and emotions that Sarah had worked hard to keep buried. Protecting innocent people from predators was not just a training scenario for her. It was the central mission that had driven her entire life. That night, unable to sleep, Sarah found herself walking the perimeter of the base under the stars. The desert air was cool and clean, a stark contrast to the cramped apartment where she had learned that the world could be a dangerous place for those unable to protect themselves. She pulled out the photograph she carried with her and studied it in the moonlight. The face looking back at her was kind and gentle, with eyes that had held infinite patience and love. This was the person who had taught her that strength came in many forms, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not for glory or recognition, but simply to keep safe the people who couldn't defend themselves. "I'm getting there, Grandpa," she whispered to the photograph. "I'm learning everything you wanted me to know." Chun Wei had been a quiet man who worked long hours in a restaurant kitchen and never spoke much about his past. But in the evenings and on weekends, he had taught his granddaughter lessons that went far beyond simple shooting techniques. He had taught her about patience, about reading people's intentions, about the responsibility that came with having the ability to protect others. Most importantly, he had taught her that sometimes good people had to be ready to do difficult things to keep evil people from hurting innocent ones. It was a lesson that had taken on urgent personal meaning when Sarah was 12 years old and had to apply it in circumstances that no child should ever face. The next morning brought advanced shooting exercises at extreme distances. Sarah's performance continued to be exceptional, but now her fellow candidates watched her with a mixture of awe and curiosity rather than skepticism. They had begun to understand that there was much more to their quiet teammate than met the eye. Rodriguez approached her after the morning session with a thoughtful expression. "Sarah, can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask. I may not answer." "Fair enough. That shot you made during Guardian Angel, in the dark at that distance, that wasn't beginner's luck. You've done something like that before, haven't you?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering how to respond. She had spent most of her life keeping her secrets, protecting herself by revealing as little as possible about her background and motivations. But something about the genuine respect in Rodriguez's voice made her willing to share a small piece of the truth. "When I was growing up, my grandfather taught me that if you have the ability to protect innocent people, then you have the responsibility to do it. He said that sometimes good people are the only things standing between evil and the helpless, and you've had to stand in that gap before." "Once," Sarah said quietly, "when I was 12 years old, I had to protect my grandmother from someone who wanted to hurt her. My grandfather had taught me well enough that I could do what was necessary." Rodriguez didn't press for details, but something in his expression suggested he understood the weight of what Sarah was telling him. "That's why you're here, isn't it? Not for the military career, but because this training will make you better at protecting people. I made a promise to my grandfather before he died. This is how I keep it." The conversation was interrupted by Captain Hayes calling the candidates to their next training session. But as Sarah walked away, she felt a strange sense of relief at having shared even a small part of her story. For most of her life, she had carried her burdens alone, but perhaps it was time to begin trusting others with the truth of who she was and why she was here. The week concluded with written examinations on ballistics, weather conditions, and tactical decision-making. Sarah scored perfectly on all sections, cementing her position as one of the top candidates in the program. But more importantly, she had proven to herself that she could handle the pressure of real-world situations where lives hung in the balance. As she prepared for Week 4, Sarah knew that the most challenging tests still lay ahead. The program was designed to push candidates to their absolute limits, and she would need to draw on every lesson her grandfather had taught her about strength, patience, and the courage to do what was necessary when everything depended on it. Week 6 arrived with an unexpected challenge that would test more than just sniper skills. Captain Hayes announced that each remaining candidate would undergo a comprehensive psychological evaluation and background review. The military needed to ensure that future snipers possessed not only the technical abilities, but also the mental stability required for operations where split-second decisions could determine life or death. This is not a pass-or-fail examination. Hayes explained to the 14 remaining candidates. This is about understanding your motivations, your stress responses, and your ability to function under extreme psychological pressure. Everyone will be interviewed individually by military psychologists and investigators. Sarah felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Throughout the program, she had carefully managed how much personal information she shared, revealing only enough to explain her capabilities without exposing the full truth of her background. Now she would face trained professionals whose job was to uncover exactly the kinds of secrets she had spent years protecting. The interviews were scheduled alphabetically, which meant Sarah would be among the last to be evaluated. She spent the intervening days watching as her fellow candidates emerged from their sessions with varying degrees of stress and relief. Some seemed confident that they had presented themselves well, while others appeared shaken by questions they hadn't expected. Rodriguez, who had developed a genuine friendship with Sarah over the weeks of training, sought her out after his interview. "They're thorough," he warned. "They don't just ask about your military service. They want to know about your childhood, your family, your motivations for being here. They ask questions that make you think about things you might have preferred to leave buried." "What kind of things?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Personal trauma, family dynamics, any experiences with violence or dangerous situations. They're trying to understand what drives you and whether you can handle the psychological stress of actually taking human lives in combat situations." Sarah nodded, her mind racing through possible approaches to the interview. She had always known this moment would come eventually, the point where her carefully constructed privacy would be challenged by people trained to see through evasions and half-truths. That evening, she called her grandmother for the first time since arriving at the training facility. Chun Mei was now 86 years old, living in the same small apartment where Sarah had grown up, and she remained the only person who knew the complete truth of Sarah's story. "How are you doing, little one?" her grandmother asked in Mandarin, using the pet name she had called Sarah since childhood. "The training is going well, Grandma. But tomorrow they want to ask me questions about why I'm here, about our family, about what happened when I was 12. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Chun Mei understood immediately what Sarah was facing. "Are you ready to tell them the truth? I don't know if I have a choice anymore. They're not going to be satisfied with vague answers about wanting to serve my country." "Then perhaps it's time, Sarah. Your grandfather always said that the truth has its own power and that hiding from it only makes you weaker in the end. But what if they decide I'm not suitable for the program? What if they think what happened makes me unstable or unreliable?" "What happened made you strong," Chun Mei said firmly. "What happened taught you lessons that these military people are trying to teach with their exercises and simulations. You learned at 12 years old what it means to protect innocent people from those who would harm them. You learned what it costs to make hard decisions when lives are at stake. These are not weaknesses, granddaughter. These are the very qualities they're looking for." The next morning, Sarah reported to Building 7 for her psychological evaluation. The interview was conducted by Dr. Patricia Reynolds, a clinical psychologist who specialized in evaluating military personnel for high-stress assignments. Dr. Reynolds was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a manner that encouraged openness while remaining professionally observant. Her office was comfortable and non-threatening, but Sarah could sense the analytical intelligence behind the psychologist's gentle questions. "Tell me about your family background, Sarah," Dr. Reynolds began. "I understand you were raised by your grandparents." "Yes, ma'am. My parents died in a car accident when I was 7 years old. My grandparents, Chun Wei and Chun Mei, took me in and raised me. That must have been a difficult transition for a young child. How did you cope with such a significant loss?" Sarah had prepared for this question, but sitting in the comfortable chair facing Dr. Reynolds, she found herself speaking more honestly than she had intended. "My grandfather helped me understand that sometimes terrible things happen to good people, and that the only way to honor those we've lost is to become strong enough to protect others from similar pain." "Is that why you're here? To protect others?" "Partially, yes." Dr. Reynolds made notes on her pad, then looked up with an expression of gentle persistence. Your marksmanship scores are extraordinary, Sarah. Where did you learn to shoot with such precision? My grandfather taught me, starting when I was 8 years old. That's quite young to begin firearms training. Was your grandfather military or law enforcement? No, ma'am. He was a chef at a Chinese restaurant. But he believed in self-reliance and the importance of being able to protect your family. I see. And did this training prove useful during your childhood? This was the question Sarah had been dreading, the moment when she would have to decide between continued evasion and complete honesty. She looked at Dr. Reynolds' encouraging expression and made a choice that surprised herself. Yes, ma'am. When I was 12 years old, I had to use what my grandfather taught me to protect my grandmother and myself from a man who was threatening to hurt us. Dr. Reynolds' pen stopped moving, and her attention became completely focused. Can you tell me what happened? Sarah took a deep breath and began to tell the story she had never shared with anyone outside her family. There was a man named Frank Morrison who lived in our apartment building. He had been bothering my grandmother for months, making inappropriate comments and following her when she went shopping. My grandfather tried to handle it by talking to the building manager and the police, but nothing changed. Go on. One evening, my grandfather was working late at the restaurant, and Morrison broke into our apartment. He was drunk and aggressive, and he said he was tired of my grandmother ignoring him. He said he was going to teach her to be more friendly. Sarah's voice remained steady, but Dr. Reynolds could see the tension in her posture as she relived the memory. My grandmother told me to hide in the bedroom, but I could hear him threatening her, and I knew the police wouldn't arrive in time to help. What did you do? My grandfather kept his hunting rifle in a locked case in his bedroom closet. He had taught me how to use it safely, and he had shown me where he kept the key in case of emergencies. I retrieved the rifle, loaded it, and returned to the living room where Morrison was threatening my grandmother. And then I told him to leave our apartment and never come back. He laughed at me and said I was just a little girl playing with Daddy's gun. He reached for my grandmother again, and I fired a warning shot into the wall. Dr. Reynolds was writing rapidly now, clearly recognizing the significance of what she was hearing. How did Morrison respond? He became very angry and said he was going to take the gun away from me and use it on both of us. When he moved toward me, I shot him in the shoulder. The wound was serious enough to stop his attack, but not life-threatening. What happened after that? The police arrived about 10 minutes later. Morrison was arrested and eventually convicted of breaking and entering and assault. The district attorney decided not to file any charges against me, ruling that I had acted in defense of my grandmother and myself. Sarah paused, looking directly at Dr. Reynolds. My grandfather said I had done exactly what he had taught me to do, that protecting innocent people from predators was one of the most important responsibilities a person could have. He said that having the ability to protect others meant having the obligation to do so when necessary. Dr. Reynolds set down her pen and studied Sarah carefully. How did this experience affect you? Sarah, that's an enormous responsibility for a 12-year-old child to handle. It taught me that evil exists in the world, and that sometimes good people are the only things standing between evil and the innocent. It taught me that preparation and training can make the difference between being a victim and being a protector. Most importantly, it taught me that having difficult skills means having difficult responsibilities. Is this why you're here? Because of what happened when you were 12. Sarah considered the question carefully. After my grandfather died 3 years ago, I promised him that I would become the best protector I could be. This training is how I honor that promise. The skills I learn here will allow me to protect people on a much larger scale than I could as a civilian. Are you here for revenge against people like Morrison? No, ma'am. I'm here because I understand that there are people in the world who prey on the innocent, and there need to be people willing and able to stop them. Revenge is about the past. Protection is about the future. Dr. Reynolds made several more notes, then looked up with an expression that suggested she was seeing Sarah in an entirely new light. Sarah, What you've shared with me explains a great deal about your performance in this program. Your situational awareness, your ability to remain calm under pressure, your precision under stress, these all make sense now. Am I going to be disqualified from the program? On the contrary, what you've described demonstrates exactly the kind of moral clarity and protective instinct that we look for in sniper candidates. You've already proven that you can make life and death decisions under extreme stress while maintaining precise judgment about appropriate use of force. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her, followed by something she hadn't expected: freedom. For years, she had carried the weight of her story alone, worried that others would judge her harshly for what she had been forced to do as a child. But Dr. Reynolds was looking at her with professional respect and human understanding. There's one more thing I need to ask you, Sarah. Are you prepared to take human lives in military operations if necessary? Yes, ma'am, but only when it's necessary to protect innocent people. I've already learned the weight of that responsibility, and I don't take it lightly. I believe you. Thank you for your honesty, Sarah. This interview is concluded. As Sarah left the building, she felt as though an enormous burden had been lifted from her shoulders. For the first time since arriving at the training facility, she didn't feel like she was hiding essential parts of herself from the people around her. That evening, Captain Hayes called Sarah to her office. The captain's expression was serious, but not disapproving as she gestured for Sarah to sit down. I've received Dr. Reynolds' report on your psychological evaluation, Hayes began. She's recommended you for immediate advancement to the final phase of training, with a notation that you demonstrate exceptional psychological preparation for sniper operations. Thank you, ma'am. Sarah, I want you to know that what you shared in that interview has been classified and will remain confidential. But I also want you to know that it explains why you've excelled in this program in ways that surprised even experienced instructors. Hayes leaned back in her chair, studying Sarah with newfound understanding. You didn't come here to learn how to be a protector, did you? You came here to become a better one. Yes, ma'am. That's exactly why I'm here. Then, let's make sure you get everything this program can teach you. As Sarah returned to her dormitory that evening, she felt a sense of completion that had been missing throughout her life. She had found her place, surrounded by people who understood the importance of her mission and respected her commitment to it. Tomorrow would bring the final phases of training, but for the first time since arriving at the facility, Sarah felt truly ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The final week of sniper training was designed as the ultimate test, a comprehensive field exercise that would simulate real combat conditions over 5 days and nights. Only 12 candidates remained from the original 32, and each would be evaluated on everything they had learned throughout the program. Sarah stood with her fellow survivors as Captain Hayes outlined the exercise. They would be inserted into mountainous terrain and tasked with providing overwatch for a simulated humanitarian convoy traveling through hostile territory. Each sniper would work alone, responsible for a specific sector, while coordinating with the others to ensure comprehensive coverage. This exercise will test every skill you've developed, Hayes explained. Marksmanship, camouflage, physical endurance, mental resilience, and tactical decision-making. You will face sleep deprivation, environmental stress, and scenarios that require split-second judgment calls. Anyone who fails any aspect of the mission will be immediately removed from the program. What made this exercise particularly challenging was that it included multiple unknown variables. The candidates had been told that actors would simulate various threats, but they were not told which threats were real and which were training scenarios. They would have to rely entirely on their judgment and training to distinguish between actual dangers and simulated ones. Sarah was assigned to overwatch the final checkpoint of the convoy route, a mountain pass where vehicles would be most vulnerable to attack. Her position was a rocky outcropping that provided excellent visibility, but required her to remain exposed to severe weather conditions. She established her hide site as dawn broke on Monday morning, carefully constructing a concealed position that would allow her to observe the approach routes while remaining invisible to anyone scanning the mountainside. The work required 3 hours of meticulous preparation, moving individual rocks and branches to create natural camouflage that would withstand close scrutiny. By 10 o'clock, Sarah was settled into position with her rifle, radio, and enough supplies to last the 5-day exercise. The convoy was not scheduled to arrive until Thursday afternoon, which meant she would spend 4 days maintaining constant vigilance while dealing with whatever challenges the instructors threw at her. The first test came Tuesday morning when movement in the valley below suggested possible hostile activity. Through her scope, Sarah observed 3 figures moving toward the convoy route, carrying what appeared to be weapons and equipment. Their movement patterns and tactical positioning suggested trained combatants rather than random hikers or local civilians. Sarah activated her radio and reported the contact, providing detailed descriptions of the individuals and their apparent intentions. The response from command was immediate. Guardian Angel 12, you are cleared to engage if they pose a direct threat to the convoy route. For the next 6 hours, Sarah tracked the 3 figures as they established what appeared to be an ambush position overlooking the road. Their behavior confirmed her assessment that they represented a genuine threat to the convoy, but she needed to wait until their hostile intent was absolutely clear before engaging. The shot came Wednesday afternoon, when one of the figures raised a rocket-propelled grenade launcher toward the road. Sarah's bullet struck the weapon itself, destroying it while avoiding permanent injury to the individual holding it. The other 2 figures immediately fled, and subsequent investigation revealed that this had been a test scenario, but one where the actors had been instructed to behave exactly like genuine threats. Outstanding judgment and precision came the radio response from Captain Hayes. You correctly identified the threat level and engaged with appropriate force. Continue mission. Wednesday night brought a severe weather system that tested every aspect of Sarah's training. Temperatures dropped below freezing, wind speeds exceeded 40 miles per hour, and driving sleet made visibility nearly impossible. Less experienced candidates might have abandoned their positions or called for extraction, but Sarah had learned long ago to endure difficult conditions when the mission required it. She spent the night in her concealed position, maintaining body heat through controlled movement and breathing techniques her grandfather had taught her during their hunting expeditions. The miserable conditions reminded her of nights she had spent as a child, watching over her grandmother when dangers lurked, and comfort was a luxury they couldn't afford. Thursday morning dawned clear and cold, with the convoy scheduled to arrive in 6 hours. Sarah's radio crackled with updates from the other sniper positions. 2 candidates had been forced to withdraw due to hypothermia from the overnight weather. Another had been discovered by the opposing force actors and eliminated from the exercise. At noon, Sarah spotted the convoy approaching her checkpoint. 3 vehicles carrying what appeared to be medical supplies and personnel for a remote mountain clinic. Her job was to ensure their safe passage through the most dangerous section of the route. As the convoy entered the narrow pass below her position, Sarah noticed movement on the opposite mountainside that hadn't been there during her previous observations. Through her scope, she could see muzzle flashes and the distinctive signatures of hostile fire being directed at the convoy. This time, the threat was unmistakably real. Live rounds were striking the convoy vehicles, and the medical personnel were taking cover as best they could. Sarah had seconds to identify targets and engage them before the convoy suffered casualties. Her first shot eliminated a sniper position approximately 800 meters away. Her second shot, taken less than 10 seconds later, disabled another hostile shooter at nearly 1,000 meters. The remaining attackers, realizing they were being engaged by a skilled marksman from an unknown position, broke contact and fled. The convoy proceeded safely through the checkpoint, and Sarah maintained her position until officially recalled Thursday evening. When she finally emerged from her hide site, She had been motionless for over 90 hours, had engaged multiple targets with perfect accuracy, and had successfully protected the convoy without being detected by either hostile forces or the personnel she was protecting. Captain Hayes was waiting at the extraction point with an expression that mixed professional admiration with personal pride. "Chun, that was some of the finest sniper work I've seen in 15 years of military service. You just completed one of the most challenging field exercises in our program with a perfect score." "Thank you, ma'am. Did everyone make it through safely?" "The convoy personnel are all safe, thanks to your intervention. As for your fellow candidates, 7 successfully completed the exercise. You scored highest overall." Friday morning brought the graduation ceremony for the surviving members of the Advanced Sniper Program. Sarah stood with 6 other graduates as they received their certifications and new assignments. She was being posted to a specialized unit that provided protective overwatch for high-risk humanitarian operations, exactly the kind of assignment that aligned with her personal mission. After the ceremony, Rodriguez approached Sarah with a smile that held genuine warmth and respect. "So what's next for you, Sarah? Are you going to tell us where you're being assigned, or is that classified?" "I'll be working with humanitarian protection details," Sarah replied, "making sure medical teams and aid workers can do their jobs safely in dangerous places." "That's perfect for you. You were born to protect people." Sarah looked around at her fellow graduates, men who had become genuine friends despite their initial skepticism about her presence. They had accepted her not because they had lowered their standards, but because she had proven herself according to the highest standards any of them could imagine. "Can I ask you something, Sarah?" Thompson said, joining the conversation. "What you did during that final exercise, staying in position for 90 hours and making those shots under pressure, that wasn't just training. You've been preparing for something like that your whole life, haven't you?" Sarah considered the question, thinking about the path that had brought her to this moment. From a frightened 12-year-old protecting her grandmother to a newly certified military sniper ready to protect strangers around the world, the journey had been longer and more difficult than she could have imagined. "My grandfather used to say that we don't get to choose when evil shows up in our lives," she said finally, "but we do get to choose whether we're ready for it when it arrives. Everything I've done has been about being ready." That evening, Sarah called her grandmother to share the news of her graduation. Chun Mei listened with the quiet pride of someone who had always known this day would come. "Your grandfather would be very proud, little one. You become exactly what he hoped you would be." "I kept my promise to him, Grandma. I became strong enough to protect people who can't protect themselves." "You were already strong, Sarah. The training just taught you how to use that strength more effectively." As Sarah prepared to leave Fort Braxton for her new assignment, she took one last look at the training facility that had become the place where she finally stopped hiding who she was and what she was capable of. She had arrived as someone who appeared to not belong, someone who seemed too small and too quiet for the demands of elite military training. She was leaving as one of the finest snipers in modern military history, ready to fulfill a promise made to her grandfather and to protect innocent people around the world. The doubters and skeptics had learned what Sarah had always known, that belonging wasn't about fitting expectations, but about having the strength and skill to fulfill your mission regardless of what others thought was possible. In her pocket, the photograph of her grandfather reminded her of the lessons that had brought her this far. Chun Wei had taught her that strength came in many forms, that preparation was the foundation of protection, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not for glory or recognition, but simply to keep safe those who couldn't defend themselves. As Sarah boarded the transport that would take her to her new assignment, she carried with her not just the skills of an elite marksman, but the wisdom of a protector who understood that true strength was measured not by what you could do to others, but by what you were willing to do for others. The little girl who had once stood between evil and innocence with her grandfather's hunting rifle had become a guardian angel who would watch over humanitarian workers in the world's most dangerous places. She had proven that heroes aren't always what we expect them to be, but They're exactly what the world needs them to be when everything depends on their courage and skill. Sarah Chun had found her place in the world, and the world was safer because of it. The promise was fulfilled, and the protector was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. She had learned to be perfectly still, perfectly patient, and perfectly precise when it mattered most. Most importantly, she had learned that sometimes the most unlikely people become exactly the heroes that innocent people need when darkness threatens to overwhelm the light. The journey from a frightened child to an elite protector was complete, but the mission of protection would continue for as long as there were people who needed a guardian angel watching over them from positions they would never see, keeping them safe from dangers they would never know existed.